Hello and welcome everyone to today's presentation of Modernizing Enterprise Java Applications, Jakarta EE, Spring Boot, and AI Integration, brought to you by Payara and DZone. I'm your host, Katie Bavoso, and I am so excited to get started with you today as we hope to empower you on your AI journey. And I'm excited to be joined by Luqman Saeed, product marketer and technical writer at Payara. A quick note just before we get started, you can feel free to use the chat feature to comment on the presentation as Luqman is sharing today. We will have a Q&A session after today's presentation, so drop your questions in the Q&A section and we'll be sure to grab them and prepare for them when it's time. Now, please join me in welcoming Luqman Saeed. Welcome, Luqman.
Thank you very much, Katie. That's very kind of you, and I'm happy to be here. This exciting collaboration with DZone, talking about arguably the hottest tech topic since the NoSQL days, AI in enterprise Java. So let's just dive into our slides here and start our discussion with enhancing enterprise Java applications with Gen AI. So our agenda is going to be quite simple. We're going to split our discussion across the two main frameworks in the enterprise Java world, Spring Boot with AI and Jakarta EE with LangChain 4J. And then we'll discuss briefly some advanced architectural notes on async processing, response caching, and security considerations. So the first question would be, naturally, why generative AI in enterprise Java? Of course, Java has been there. It's going to be 30 years this year, and it's been an old guard in the enterprise space. There's a massive number of applications written in Java that are out there. And the question I get sometimes is, why bother with AI in Java applications? Now, AI, as it is today, is a very interesting technology, and even for enterprise applications written in Java, you would want to integrate AI to enhance the capability of some of these applications. A lot of them, or quite a number of them, significant number of them, are very old. You can consider them as legacy systems, and also you'd want to adopt AI in your enterprise Java application to improve user experiences with domain-specific insight. In fact, one of the powerful things about AI is the ability to assimilate your domain-specific knowledge and then present them to the users in a conversational manner. So it's one of the reasons why you'd want to adopt AI in your enterprise application. And then also to maintain the enterprise-grade reliability of your applications, then cost-effective implementation. AI is really something that you can implement in a cost-effective manner without breaking the bank, as would be seen. So it's something you'd want to think about, especially if you want to future-proof your business and your application, and then also guarantee your customers that you are moving with the times. Because at this point, nearly every product is adopting AI in one way or the other, and you really wouldn't want to be caught unawares or off guard with nothing AI. Your customers would not be happy, your shareholders would not be happy. So definitely you would want to look at AI from the perspective of your enterprise Java application. Also, rapid integration cycles. It's very easy, as will be seen, to integrate AI into your enterprise Java application, whether it's a Spring application or a Jakarta EE application. So why not? Now, why generative AI? Again, still, legacy system enhancement, AI-powered documentation search, which is what we'll be implementing. One of the powerful features of AI is the concept of retriever-augmented generation, which we'll be looking at in the code. Retriever-augmented generation is pretty much taking your internal domain knowledge and then giving it to the AI to make it accessible to users in a conversational manner. Think of users chatting with your internal documentation, not reading, but chatting. They can ask questions and get human-like responses based on your internal domain documentation. This is very powerful, and it's something that you really should explore in your enterprise applications. So one of the best things for that is domain-specific knowledge, making it accessible to your employees. Think of onboarding new employees instead of reading through pages and pages and pages of Confluence data. They could simply just type their questions into a text box and then get human-like conversational responses based on the information you have fed to the LLM, the large language model. Very powerful, and needless to say, it's going to be a big boost to onboarding people, to customer service, and all of these things, myriad of things that we used to do. With some amount of effort, this is going to be very easy and near instantaneous to get results on. So why not? Now, framework-specific integration of course, now you want to integrate AI into your enterprise application. But your application was written in Spring or Jakarta EE. And okay, you'll be asking, what are the options? From the Spring perspective, or in the Spring world, Spring has Spring AI. It's a native AI tooling that comes with Spring out of the box. So you don't need to do anything. You just need to add a dependency to your project and then have it running. And personally, I like it a lot because it's part of the Spring platform. And when we come to security, I'll be discussing this. One of the ways to mitigate security threats is to, as Adam Bean will say, the legendary Adam Bean. If you're in the Java world, you would know Adam Bean. As Adam Bean would say, use the platform. So if Spring AI comes with this Spring platform, then all the better, because you simply have it available and it's a matter of reading the documentation, or if Spring implements chatting with the documentation, it's a matter of asking the Spring AI questions about how to implement AI in your application using Spring AI. You get what I'm doing, right? So it's just a matter of reading the documentation and then implementing the tooling. Now, Spring Boot has native tooling for AI integration. There is a RAG pipeline support, which we'll be looking at using Firebase. What we'll be doing would be creating a RAG pipeline or retrieval augmented generation pipeline using Firebase storage, and then using Neon database or Neon DB. Neon is a hosted service, Postgres hosted service for Postgres databases, and it comes out of the box with PG Vector. PG Vector is a plugin for Postgres that allows the storing of embeddings into a Postgres database. So pretty much these are the services we'll be using along with Spring AI to implement the retrieval augmented generation. But before we look at that, it's important to just step back and then discuss what retrieval augmented generation is within this context. Now, as I stated earlier, one of the strengths of the large language models out there is pretty much taking your internal domain information and then making it accessible. However, you and I communicate in English. We speak English, we understand words, we understand nuances in words and all of that. Unfortunately, large language models are huge statistical machines that just understand numbers and make predictions based on those numbers. And so, as I'm talking to you, you would think that an LLM is something I can talk to this way, but I can't talk to an LLM this way. Even though I'll be typing my question or speaking English, most of the time the LLM is just hearing or seeing numbers. And the concept of retrieval augmented generation is pretty much taking your internal domain knowledge, converting that domain into numbers or the numerical representation of that domain data, and then making it available as a context to the large language model when questions are asked about your domain. So retrieval augmented generation, as the name now implies, is pretty much augmenting the retrieval of responses from the large language models. And that is pretty much what it is. So there are 3 steps. There is your data that you embed. And then when a question is asked, you go to the embedding, find the closest, or the embedded data, find the closest match to the query, and then send that closest match along with the query as context to the large language model to formulate responses based on that. That is pretty much what an LLM does well, and that is pretty much what retrieval augmented generation is. And as we stated, we'll be implementing that with Spring AI. And in the Jakarta EE world, again, you want to implement AI, but your application is written in Jakarta EE. You are not left behind. There is the LangChain4j library that you can use as well in your Jakarta EE application. We'll be seeing that in the code to implement retrieval augmented generation in your Jakarta EE application. So for these 2 major enterprise Java platforms, there are already tools and libraries out there that you can use to implement generative AI features and capabilities in your application. The most important thing you would need to consider is what exactly you want to do with the LLM, or you want the LLM to do, or you want Gen AI to add, what value you want Gen AI to add to your application. But in terms of tooling and APIs and libraries, there is quite enough out there for you to implement in your enterprise Java application. Okay, so this is my favorite part. This is where we jump into the code. Let me first start with Jakarta EE, and I'll bring my IDE to the screen here. I'll bring my IDE to the screen here, and then we start from the old guard. You might be wondering why I'm starting from Jakarta EE instead of Spring. I'm starting from Jakarta EE because in my culture, you pay reverence to seniors. And Jakarta EE is a senior brother to Spring. So I'm starting from the old guard, or as you might call it, J2EE. So let's start from there. Now, in the slide, we talked about retrieval augmented generation, and we said it's a pipeline. You take your domain data, and then you embed that data. By embedding, I mean taking that data and converting it to the numerical representation of that data. Of course, when you convert it to the numerical representation, we will need to store that data somewhere. So there are 3 points: the data itself, the embedding process, and then the storing. The storing, there are different vector databases out there, but of course, the vulnerable Postgres works just fine. And in our sample here, we're going to be using the Neon database. So let's look into the code. I have a Postgres embedding service implementation here. That is, as you can see, is pretty much a very, very underwhelming Java class. Now, bits of Jakarta EE are in here. We have the class set as an application scope singleton. And in Jakarta EE, this annotation here marks this class as an application scoped singleton. What I'm doing up here is creating a data source. The data source is pretty much how the application is going to connect to the database. Remember, when we embed the data, when we embed our internal domain data, we would need to store it somewhere. The storage process, the process of storing the embedded data, you need to connect to the database. And the way to connect to the database is through a data source. In Java, whether in Spring or Jakarta EE, the concept of data source is the same. So what we are doing here is creating a data source definition. Now, there are some variables here, as you can see, that I'm using. Now, these are from the microprofile config API. Microprofile is a sort of a third-party library for creating cloud-native Jakarta EE applications. And microprofile config here, I'm using it to externalize core part of the application. Now, when we are talking about security, one of the surefire ways to secure an application is to externalize key features of the or key parameters of the application. So, for instance, this is my OpenAI API key. There is no security person will ask you to bundle it with your application. And of course, generally, you should not bundle anything that can be used against you in your application from the security perspective. You want to externalize those to the application so that depending on the environment the application is running in, these can be injected into the application. And that is what we are doing here with the microprofile config API. Now, there are a few things here. The whole code will be available for you to explore later on. The most important part here are the LangChain parts that we have. This is the embedding store we are creating. We are creating a PG vector embedding store. Now, Spring has something very similar. When we get to the Spring code, you're going to see what I mean. We have the PG vector embedding store. We also have the embedding model that we're going to use. We have a document splitter and we have an ingester. These are all different bits that we need to, first of all, take the document, split the document into smaller chunks, take these smaller chunks and give to the embedding model, and then the embedding model gives us the numerical representation of the data. And then we finally store that. And this embed new docs here, this method is where all of that work takes place. So what's going on here? For starters, we get a list of objects. By object here, I mean blob object in our Firebase storage. It could be AWS S3. It could be any other blob storage service out there. I'm just using Firebase because it's simple to get started, or it's simpler to get started with. So we first get a list of blob documents, and for each blob document, we load the document here. We load the document, and then pretty much for each document, we walk through, split the document, embed the document, and then store the embedding. That is pretty much all that we are doing here. Now, you might be wondering where the blob documents are coming from, and that is where I bring in my Firebase console here, Firebase. Like I said, you need, it could be anywhere. It doesn't need to be a blob storage service. It could be any other service out there. It could be S3 bucket. It could be a local file system. It doesn't matter. As long as your application can read it, it doesn't matter. It just has to be a set of files. The files could be anything. It could be PDF. It could be text files. It could be CSV, depending on your domain. But most of the time, I find that PDF works fine. So I find that PDF works fine. So that's what I like to convert the data to. And most of your data will be in PDF anyway. So this is the Firebase blob storage here. Now, this particular directory here is being scanned by the application. And when a file is uploaded here, it's going to be pulled in and then embedded. So let me clear all of this here. And then let's see. Now, as you can see in the logs, this is constantly running, looking for a file to embed here. Now, let me come in here and then embed a file, upload a file here. Let me see. Go to bring this here. Let's pick a file from local storage and embed. It could be any file, but most of the time you're going to be, of course, embedding domain-specific data. It could be but one thing, as we're going to talk about security, one thing I want you to keep in mind is to be very much aware that you should not put things that you don't want out there to the LLM. If you don't want the data is confidential or anything, then it should not be put out there. It should not be embedded. It's not going to be part of it shouldn't be part of anything you do with the LLM, because you just can't guarantee that the data is going to be or stay confidential. So please, generally, as I stated, one of the best things for LLMs, incorporating them in your application, would be to enhance customer service or documentation. And most of the time, these are publicly available. So you could put them out there just fine, just as this here. This is the Power Cloud documentation here. Now, we are uploading this documentation to the blob storage, and hopefully this gets picked up and then embedded in the application. Now, once the embedding takes place, this is going to be stored in the database. Again, this is pretty much all there is to it in terms of the embedding. Now, the other side of the embedding is when you are querying the data. When querying information, when asking information, you want to now go to the database. Now, as you can see here, the file has been picked up and then it's being embedded. And most of the time, depending on the speed and everything, it's going to take quite some time to embed. Now, I can go, so as you can see here, these are the embeddings. This is the numerical representation of the data. You and I understand English words. The large language models, the LLMs, just understand numbers. This is what they see. And this is how they make their statistical predictions based on the closest match to whatever you are asking them. So now we have a numerical representation of this data. As you can see, it can get quite huge depending on the size of the document. And all of this is going to get stored in the database. So I can go to my Neon database here, and then we can take a look at it. Okay, Neon is saying I've used my allowance. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so this is going to be stored. I'm not so sure what's going on. This is going to be stored in the database. And then when a query is made, the large language model is going to take the closest match here to respond to that particular query. And pretty much that is all. Now, if you look at the code, you can see there is nothing very specific to Jakarta EE here. There are only small bits of Jakarta EE, like the @inject to inject the properties, and then the creation of the data source and the transactional annotation here. But generally, everything is in place. It's just pure Java that we are writing here. Now, let's go to the Spring counterpart and take a look at what is going on here. Now, in the Spring world, we have pretty much the same concept, except that Spring goes one step further to make it even easier. Now, in Spring, I have this particular PG vector here. Now, if you look at the Jakarta EE version, there was something similar here. We have the PG vector embedding. There is something similar in Spring here, which is PG vector here. Look down here, PG vector. Yes, this PG vector here. We have this PG vector that we are injecting here. Now we are creating, or we are instantiating this particular bean over here and then injecting it. We are qualifying the bean, and so we are injecting by that qualified name here. So this bean here is the PG vector that is going to do the bulk of the work for us. So in this particular instance here, we are doing pretty much what we saw in Jakarta EE. We have a chat method. This is also a Spring bean. It's a singleton scoped bean. That is doing pretty much what we saw earlier. So we have the PG vector store here that takes the document, blah, 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 creates an advisor based on that, and then gets the information from the vector database and then create a response. Now in Spring here, I'm doing pretty much the same thing, except that I'm using the PG vector object that I created to do the embedding and storing in the database. So as you can see, they are very, very similar. Spring and Jakarta EE have pretty much the same construct. And surprise, 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 behind the scenes, Spring is using LangChain for J. In Java EE or in Jakarta EE, I am using LangChain for J, and Spring, I'm using Spring AI. But behind the scenes, Spring AI is actually built on top of LangChain for J. So you can see the constructs are very similar. The vector store here is the same thing. We load the object, and then for each object, we create an embedding and then pretty much store it in the database. That is all we're doing here. So the vector store, and Spring even again goes a step further to make it easy to create document. A document is pretty much just that. A document is a container for content and metadata. It could be anything. Most of the time, it's going to be a PDF document, which is what I recommend. Spring makes it easy to create documents. So we create a document, and then we pretty much embed the document in the database, store it in the database. And so in Jakarta EE, I did about 3 lines. In Spring, those 3 lines have been reduced to 2 lines. So again, it sounds very intimidating, but in your applications or in the real world, incorporating Gen AI in your enterprise application, whether through Spring or through Jakarta EE, is pretty simple. Again, in Spring, there is Spring AI. All you have to do is to add Spring AI to your application, and then that is it. You have it available. And most of the time in enterprise applications, you are going to build retrieval augmented generation pipelines, because most enterprises have a humongous amount of internal data available. And one of the surefire ways of making sense of all this data is to use the large language models to see through them, whether to analyze the data, to find patterns, or to make it easy for people to be able to query the data. You're going to pretty much use retrieval augmented generation. And as we've seen so far, retrieval augmented generation, whether through Jakarta EE or Spring, is fairly easy. All you need to do is start. Most of the time, I would recommend Postgres database because it's the venerable and mother of all databases. I know you'll probably disagree with me, but we can discuss that later, or you can discuss that in the comments. I think Postgres is the #1. So you're going to be using Postgres, or you should use Postgres with PG vector enabled, and then you store your information. Now, in terms of embedding, if you look at the Jakarta EE code here, I am explicitly using an embedding model that I am actually creating here. And in this case, I am using OpenAI's text embedding 3 large model here. Now, depending on your use case, you're going to use a different model, or you probably host your own model in-house, or whichever. It doesn't matter. In the end, you're going to need a model to create the embeddings for you. Now, if you come to the Spring world here, Spring actually makes it much easier because everything is built in. So over here in the loading, I get the document by key and then use the page PDF document reader to pretty much create the document. And then once I create the document, all I'm doing here is embedding those documents. And once you embed those documents, that is one side of the retrieval. And the other side is when a question is asked about the document, you would need to augment the response. And in Spring, this is achieved through the concept of advisor. An advisor here is pretty much, as the name implies, will advise the model based on the contextual information retrieved from the embeddings. And again, Spring makes it quite easy to create an advisor and then use that advisor, or give that advisor the chance to go to the database, retrieve contextual information, and pretty much create a response. Again, the code is available for you on GitHub. The links will be made available for you to explore further. But pretty much this is the round trip information for incorporating Gen AI into your application, whether it's Spring or Jakarta EE. It's fairly simple, and once you figure out the simplicity, it's quite underwhelming because AI has been made so has gained so much notoriety that it feels like it's going to be very complicated, but it's really not. It's not complicated. So this is pretty much the basics. Now, once you have those in place, you will have to think about scalability. You will have to think about scalability. Now, let's go back to our PowerPoint slides and then continue our discussion there. Okay, so back from the code journey, in terms of scalability, you're going to think about how to handle asynchronous processing. Now, in the sample code, again, it's going to be made available to you. In the sample code, we are doing quite simple things. Everything is done on the main thread. But in real-world enterprise applications, you're going to have a lot of load. And I said you're going to probably have a humongous amount of data, and you're going to have a lot of data coming in. You have a data pipeline with data coming in, wherever that data is coming from. If you have an e-commerce store, you're going to have a lot of customer data coming in. You're going to have so many things coming in that will need to be sorted, filtered, analyzed. All of that will need to be done on the data. It's going to be very, 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 very bad for your application to run everything on the main thread. And that is where you need to think about scalability. You need to think about proper optimization. Now, both Jakarta EE and Spring have already solved this problem for you. Now, in the Spring world, you can use the async annotation to pretty much create asynchronous methods. These are methods that should or that will run in different threads from the original calling thread. And in terms of embedding, this is something that you will want to do for large data set. So in our example, if some job is to upload incoming data to a blob storage, and then the application will be picking this information, then you want to run the embedding process in a separate thread just to make the application much more performant. If you do everything on the main thread, remember, large language models or incorporating Gen AI would most of the time require you to talk to external services. Most of the time, you're going to be using OpenAI's API because they are the first movers, and I find their API very easy to incorporate and get started with. Now, the moment in an application you start talking to external services, then you really want to keep at the back of your mind things like scalability and async processing. And so once the concept of talking to external services comes in, then you would need to do that task or carry out that task on a separate thread. And in that case, you'd want to use Spring's async annotation. In the Jakarta EE world, there is the managed executor service that you can simply inject into the application. Again, all of that, I've implemented that in the sample code for you already. So you inject the managed executor service, and then you submit your services to or your task to the managed executor service, and that is going to spawn a new thread and carry out these async processes on them for you. Also, you might want to, in terms of async processing and scalability, you might want to think of batch processing. And so in the example we saw, it's not every single file that you want to pick and then embed. Most of the time, you want to batch them. So you want to create a batch process that runs at specific intervals. So let's say 4 times a day. And then these 4 times daily, the batch processor is going to scan the blob storage container for newly uploaded documents. If there are any, it's going to pick them, embed them, and then move them from that container. And so you want to, in the end, most of the time, as with everything programming, it's an it depends situation. So You want to look at your own application and then decide which is the best. But generally, you want to think about scalability right from the beginning, because the moment, again, I'm talking about real world applications with existing context. If you are now starting out, you shouldn't optimize for no users. You have nothing to optimize because you have nothing. But if an application has been there for years, there's going to be a lot of data, there's going to be a lot of context. And so in those cases, it depends whether to use async processing or whether to use batch processing. Personally, I lean towards batch processing because it's efficient and it's also easier to debug, because when there is a problem, you know a specific set of documents, you know a specific batch run caused this problem. But for every single document, there could be a few performance issues. But again, it depends. Then also you want to think about error handling and retries. Again, both Spring and Jakarta EE have this resilient construct that you can implement to handle errors properly in a graceful manner. So if a method fails, you want to retry. For instance, if you are doing retrieval augmented generation and then for some reason your storage bucket is not accessible, a good example in this case is that the database I'm using says I've reached my limit for the day. 5 minutes before coming to speak with you here, it wasn't so, but once I got in, it says it's so. So you want to implement retries and say, okay, if there's an error, then retry this. If there's an error, let me gracefully handle the error. So these are all things that you'd want to consider. Now, I am very certain you are very much aware that all these things that I'm talking about have nothing to do with Gen AI or Spring or Jakarta EE. These are core software development constructs that apply to nearly every software development domain. And that is the beauty of it. Gen AI itself, the process of incorporating it, is no different from implementing any other feature in your application. Now we come to the ever-present security considerations. Please, please, and please again, do not bundle API keys with your application. I am begging you, do not bundle. There's been too many problems out there about people forgetting and bundling security keys with their applications and then pushing to external repositories. 100% of the time, keys and secure access credentials should be externalized. And so if you are developing locally, it should be externalized to your local development environment so that your application can pull it and inject it into your application. In staging, in development and everything, it should be available in the environment, but never, ever with the application. Do not bundle the keys. In the example code that you have access to, the keys are externalized, so you would need to provide them to be able to run the code. So please, that will be my first point. Do not bundle the keys with your application. Also, you might want to encrypt sensitive data, implement role-based access control. In the Jakarta EE version of the application, there is the need to log in. The application checks for access token to grant access to the back end of the application. Also, you want to have audit trails for compliance. These are all things that in many jurisdictions, these are legal requirements. These are things that should be available because they are verifiable things. When you flout the law, you will find out. So these are things that you want to keep in mind: encrypt sensitive data, secure keys and credentials. Externalize your access credentials, please. Externalize them, encrypt sensitive data, implement role-based access control. Of course, you also want to monitor the AI service usage and then audit trails for compliance. For future development, enhanced security features, multi-region deployment, advanced embedding techniques, and then additional vector store support. Yeah, and then more. Why not? The good thing, again, with the incorporation of Gen AI into Java EE, Jakarta EE, or Spring applications is that you don't need to change much. You don't need to change much in your existing application infrastructure to incorporate them. And my advice would be to start with the simplest cases, which is use external services like OpenAI or any other AI service. Google, Microsoft, they all offer API services. Start with those instead of trying to. I've seen a number of people start by trying to host and do everything in-house, and then they freak out with the complexity. Start as simple as you can. Use external services. They are mostly pay as you go. They are easy to get started. And then incorporate. The most important thing is to build the foundation. Once you have the foundation laid out, it's very easy to move things in-house in the future. But start simple, build on what you have, test, test, look at your domain situation, and then amend the implementation to suit your domain situation. And then as you go, you can properly optimize Gen AI in your Java, enterprise Java applications. And that brings me to the end. Kati, any questions for me?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Lukman. That was amazing. And as you see, we do have a QR code here for anybody that would like to learn more, but we do have some questions in the chat, Lukman, if you would like to give us a little bit more information for our
Sure.
audience. Awesome. I'll bring out the first question. So we have one that goes, how do you ensure backward compatibility when upgrading AI models in production systems? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is exactly why I advise that you start with external services. Most of the time, when you are using an external service, the onus of making sure that the API is backwards compatible, you pretty much defer that to the company. So if you're using Google service, Google will make sure that your API doesn't break. If they make any breaking change, Google is going to make sure that they inform you to be able to implement those breaking changes. But most of the time, the APIs stay the same, and then they will add on to it. They hardly break the API, at least in so far as I've been using Gen AI, the APIs hardly break. But again, it's software. You will have things breaking once in a while. There'll be breaking changes, but when these happen, again, if you go back to what I said earlier, start with the simplest building blocks. If you build on the simplest building blocks and sort of like a Lego stack on it, when there's a breaking change, it's easy to incorporate that breaking change and make the necessary changes at the specific layer that that breaking change impact. And that makes it easy for you. But if you start with complexity and everything is complex, any small change will cause a lot of pain in-house. So again, build like Lego, step by step, brick by brick. So in the unlikely event that there is any breaking change from your external service provider, it's easy to know where that change impacts and know how to go about that.
Great answer, and thank you so much. This next one is one that I'm also curious about. What emerging trends in AI do you think will have the biggest impact on enterprise Java development over the next few years?
That's a very interesting question. At the moment, things are moving so fast that looking into the crystal ball, everything is just moving so fast. But I can say that as it's going, Gen AI or AI in general is going to get so commoditized that it's going to be very common, and over a period of time, people will start expecting it as part of whatever service you are offering. So I don't know the exact, I can't tell the exact form because things are moving way too fast for everybody. But I can say that it's going to become an expectation of your users that there is something to do with AI in whatever offering you have. Whether you have an e-commerce store, whether you have, it doesn't matter what you have, but there is going to be some form of expectation that it has something to do with AI. So I would advise that you just be ready to incorporate it. You start incorporating it today, little by little. Look at your application, your service, your offering, and see where you can start, because I don't know exactly how, but as things are going, it's going to become an expectation. Your users will start expecting to be able to ask questions. Your users would want to have conversational live chat with whatever offering you have. Probably your users would not want to speak with an agent, but would want to just type in their query and then have their problem solved. I don't know, but it's just going to be interesting because the pace of the advancement, I think it's more than everything or anything we've ever seen. I can't tell, but I know that your users will start expecting. So you should start looking at Gen AI in your enterprise application.
So what you're saying is you'll be back in a few months with me to be able to go over this again when the next big AI tool hits that we have to
Absolutely. I'm
integrate.
looking forward to it. This is a huge topic, and we can have about 3 more sessions just to cover each of them in detail. So why not? Absolutely.
I love that. I love that. I will be there. And I also want to consider that many of our audience members are on different paths and different areas in their journey. Some are just starting out, some are very deep into it already. So what advice would you give to developers who are just starting to explore integration in their Java projects? What can they do to continue down this path?
My first advice would be, don't get intimidated. It's very easy to get overwhelmed. It's very easy to pretty much just give up and say it's too much. But as with everything, we've seen it before in the software industry. There was a time when everything and everybody was talking about NoSQL. There was a time everything was about NoSQL. There was a time when every problem was solved by NoSQL databases, and we're still here. So the first thing I would say would be, don't get intimidated. Slow yourself down and then take things bite by bite, small chunks, one step at a time, small. Start somewhere. Start with anything. Start with a pet project. In the end, your goal should be to offer some kind of value. You should have a specific goal that has some kind of value to offer, whether yourself, your family, your friends, your business. You should have a specific goal and then work backwards from that goal. I want my application to be able to do X. Walk back from that and ask yourself how AI can help you achieve that. And then look at the tooling available. Again, as we've briefly explored, both in Jakarta EE and in Spring, it's very easy. It's dead easy to incorporate Gen AI. The act of incorporating itself is dead simple. The question of the why, the business question, is what you need to answer. Why are you incorporating it? What do you want it to do for you? What is the business value you expect from it? Once you're able to pinpoint answers to these questions, things should fall in place for you. But the most important thing, don't get intimidated, because everybody will talk about AI for the foreseeable future. It doesn't mean that it's overly complicated. It's just that is the nature of things. Everybody's talking about it, and nobody wants to be left out. So everybody's talking about it. So it's very easy to feel intimidated, but don't. Ask yourself the business questions. The technical implementation is simple. The business aspect is what you need to answer, and then everything should fall in place for you.
Very well said. And I think advice that we can apply to a lot of different things in life. But sticking on this journey now with AI, if somebody wanted to dive deeper into this topic, what resources or even communities would you recommend that they find or join to learn more?
Very simple. In terms of resources, again, read the documentation. If it's Spring AI, Spring has excellent guides and documentations out there that you can read over one weekend and then have a prototype up and running. If it's Jakarta EE has solid documentation, both from Jakarta EE and at Payara, we have excellent documentation. We've covered Jakarta EE end-to-end in everything that you can get started with. Read the documentation. Also, you want to keep a tab on the latest development. So as a developer, I'm subscribed to a lot of developer-focused Reddit. If you're not on Reddit, you probably would want to follow up on either Twitter or Blue Sky. But in the end, there is so much information that you need some kind of way to aggregate them. And I find these communities, or especially on Reddit, there are excellent developer communities that are focused on AI that will distill some of these things into easily digestible chunks for you to follow along. But the greatest, the simplest, the fastest, the surefire way would be to pretty much read the documentation, and a lot of the documentations are great. Of course, who knows, you could actually end up writing an application that makes some of these documentations available for people to use and converse with through AI. Who knows? So read the documentation. You could get an idea from that.
Well, Lukman, I know I've enjoyed our time together today, and I know our audience has too, but we're out of questions or out of time for more questions at the moment. We're never out of questions on this topic. So if you were unable in the chat to have your question answered, don't worry. Someone will be in touch and reach out to you after the event to make sure that your questions are answered. But Lukman, where can people go to learn more about Payara and the work that your team is doing? Like I said, I know we have a slide up, but why don't you tell us where we can go to learn more?
Sure. Payara, we are a runtime development company. Pretty much we develop application servers as they used to be called. But we are a Jakarta EE, or we were a Jakarta EE focused company. And we stepped back and looked at the entire Java ecosystem and said, things are very complicated. If you are using Spring, you need a specific place to deploy your application. And most companies, from our experience, they use both Spring and Jakarta EE, and some even now have added Quarkus to the mix. So we stepped back and then thought for a while and then developed Payara Cloud. And our next generation version of Payara Cloud is pretty much one Java platform for all your enterprise Java frameworks. So whether you are using Spring, whether you are using Quarkus, whether you are using Jakarta EE, we support them all from development to production. You can develop and deploy your enterprise Java application with ease. And this is all automated for you. You don't need to lift a finger. If you've used any of the JavaScript frameworks, Vercel, or any of those JavaScript development and deployment platforms, think of that, but for enterprise Java. So simply take your application, click a few buttons, and then boom, it's deployed for you automatically, complete with an accessible URL over the internet. That is what we are doing at Payara, and that is what we are building with our next generation Payara Cloud. You really should take it for a spin.
Lukman, thank you so much for your time today. I've appreciated it. I've had a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you too. Pleasure being here. Hopefully we get to meet again and talk more about AI.
Well, we have to. A few months and it'll be all different again. So yes, absolutely. I look forward to our next conversations, Lukman. And thank you at home for joining our webinar today. If you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out and learn more about Payara. Once again, I'm Katie Bavoso for D-Zone, and thanks for watching.